Dad perfect events. I stood there in the freezing Detroit rain, watching my pregnant daughter on her knees in that expensive driveway, shivering like a broken bird. That's when I knew I was going to destroy the man who put her there. But let me back up. My name is Carl. I'm 58. Worked 32 years at the Ford plant in Dearborn before I retired last spring. Raised my girl, Rachel, all by myself after her mom died when she was 12. Rachel was my world, sweet, artistic, always painting watercolors in our little kitchen. She deserved better than what I could give her, and I thought Brett was going to be that better life. Brett Morrison looked perfect on paper. Insurance adjuster, made good money, drove a BMW, lived in one of those fancy subdivisions in Bloomfield Hills. When he started dating Rachel 3 years ago, I was happy for her. Here was this polished guy treating my daughter like a princess, bringing her flowers every Friday, taking her to nice restaurants I couldn't afford. I figured she'd hit the jackpot. The warning signs were there from the start, but I missed them. Little things that seemed like he was just being helpful. The way he'd gently correct Rachel's pronunciation at dinner, saying, "It's ask, not axe, honey," with this patient smile. How he'd suggest she change her dress because the one she wore was a bit too casual for his family's events. Rachel would just smile that accommodating smile and go change. She was 26, head over heels in love, blinded by the life he promised her. The first time I felt something cold in my gut was at the engagement dinner. Brett's mother, Nancy, this woman who wore pearls like armor, looked at my calloused hands and offered me the salad fork with a pitying smile, explaining which utensil was for what course. It wasn't the fork that bothered me. It was the way Brett didn't even glance at me when his mother did it. He just looked at Rachel, and for a split second, I saw something that wasn't love. It was ownership. The wedding was massive. Brett's family paid for everything at this country club in Bloomfield Township that probably cost more than my house. They insisted on handling all the arrangements, said they wanted everything just so. I offered to pay for the flowers, just wanted to contribute something to my daughter's day. But Nancy waved her hand like I was being silly, said they had a specific florist who only worked with appropriate budgets. I walked Rachel down the aisle that day. She looked like an angel in that $5,000 dress, but her hand was trembling on my arm. "Are you happy, sweetheart?" I whispered as we got halfway down. She looked at Brett waiting at the altar, and the trembling stopped. "I am, Dad. He's gonna take care of me." That phrase stuck in my throat. Take care of her, like she couldn't take care of herself. When I handed her over, Brett took her hand without even nodding at me, just turned his back, effectively blocking me from her view during the ceremony. It was symbolic, though I didn't realize how literal it would become. The reception was all champagne and speeches where Brett talked about how he'd refined Rachel, like she was some rough diamond he'd polished. Nancy gave a toast about how breeding tells and how happy they were to welcome someone with Rachel's artistic temperament into their family. The way she said artistic temperament made it sound like a character flaw. The first year of marriage should be the honeymoon phase. For Rachel, it became the beginning of an erasure. Slowly, she stopped painting. She told me Brett didn't like the smell of turpentine in their pristine townhouse, said it gave him headaches. Then she stopped visiting as much. She'd call instead of coming over, said Brett liked her to be home when he got back from the office. I tried calling her directly, but often Brett would answer, "Oh, she's in the bath," or "She's napping," or "We're just heading out." When I did speak to her, her voice sounded different, thinner, stretched tight. She talked about charity galas and dinner parties, things that never used to interest her. It was like she was reading from a script written by someone else. One Saturday afternoon, I drove over to surprise her. I found her sitting in their back garden, just staring at this perfect rose bush like she was hypnotized. When she saw my truck pull up, she actually flinched. "Dad, you shouldn't be here," she whispered, glancing back toward the house nervously. "Brett doesn't like unannounced visits. It disrupts his schedule." Schedule? My daughter was living by a timetable in her own home. That's when I started paying closer attention to things that had seemed normal before. How Brett would check his watch when Rachel was talking. How he'd finish her sentences for her at restaurants. How he'd make little comments about her weight, her clothes, her small-town mannerisms that needed work. Then came the news that should have been the happiest day of my life. Rachel was pregnant. I was going to be a grandpa. When she called to tell me, I could hear the excitement mixed with something else in her voice. Fear, maybe, or uncertainty. I thought this would change things, soften Brett, make their house feel more like a home. I was wrong about everything. The pregnancy became another tool of control. Brett decided what she ate, when she slept, who she could see, all under the guise of protecting the heir, as Nancy started calling the baby. They cut off Rachel's access to their joint bank accounts completely now. Brett gave her a weekly allowance like she was a 16-year-old, said pregnant women shouldn't worry about financial decisions. I found out how bad things had gotten when we went for coffee at that little place on Woodward Avenue. Rachel ordered a $4 latte and her card got declined. She turned bright red, hands shaking as she tried the card again. "I'm sorry," she stammered to the barista. "Brett must have forgotten to transfer my allowance this week. That broke something in me. My daughter, 28 years old, couldn't buy herself a cup of coffee. I paid for it and slipped her 5 $100 bills when she wasn't looking, told her to hide it for emergencies. Don't tell Brett," I said. She nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes about even having her own money. By month 6 of the pregnancy, Nancy had essentially moved into their guest room. She'd come over every morning like she owned the place, white-gloving everything Rachel did. How she cleaned the baseboards, how she folded Brett's shirts, how much weight she was gaining. "You're getting heavy," Nancy would say, watching Rachel push food around her plate. "Brett doesn't like sloppy women. The baby doesn't need you eating like a field hand." Rachel was 6 months pregnant. She was supposed to gain weight, but she'd just nod and push her plate away, trying to make herself smaller in every possible way. That's when I started doing some real digging. I couldn't just sit there watching my daughter disappear. I'd retired from Ford with a decent pension and time on my hands. Started making phone calls to guys I knew around town. Jimmy, who worked at the courthouse, Mike from the bank, Tommy, who did title searches for a living. I wanted to know who these Morrison people really were behind all that polish. What I found was interesting. The Morrison wealth was huge on paper, but it was all leveraged to hell and back. They lived on credit and reputation, borrowing against assets to maintain their lifestyle. Brett's insurance company was facing 3 quiet lawsuits for wrongful claim denials. The family was bleeding money faster than they could make it, but they spent like Saudi royalty to keep up appearances. Brett's BMW leased. The Bloomfield Hills house mortgaged to 95% of its value. Nancy's jewelry, half of it was high-quality costume pieces. They were drowning, but Rachel didn't know any of this. She thought these people were untouchable titans of industry. The psychological abuse got worse as Rachel's belly grew. One evening she called me crying so hard I could barely understand her. "He threw away my paints, Dad. All of them. Said the nursery needed the space and he didn't want the baby exposed to lowbrow hobbies." My blood was boiling. "Come home, Rachel. I've got plenty of room. Come back to me." There was this long, terrible silence. "I can't," she finally whispered. "He says if I leave, his lawyers will make sure I never see the baby. He says I'm mentally unstable, Dad. He has files on me, things I wrote in my diary when I was 17, poems about being sad after Mom died. He's twisting everything to make me look crazy." The trap was completely shut now. They'd isolated her, made her financially dependent, and now they were threatening her with losing her own child. I realized I couldn't storm in there like some angry father-in-law. They'd call the cops, paint me as the aggressive working-class thug, and use it against Rachel in court. I had to be smarter than that, so I changed tactics completely. Stopped challenging Brett on anything. When he made his little comments about Rachel's background, I just smiled and nodded. Started bringing Nancy flowers when I visited. Complimented her decorating. It tasted like sawdust in my mouth, but I needed them to lower their guard. I needed access to their world. Meanwhile, I was quietly liquidating everything I had. Sold my house in Dearborn to a cash buyer, moved into a small apartment. Cashed in my 401k and pension early, took the tax hit. See, back in 2003, I'd invested $20,000 in this little logistics software company that some tech guy at work told me about. Most of the guys at the plant thought I was crazy, throwing money at computers. But that company got bought by Microsoft in 2019 for $300 million. My slice of that pie was worth more than Brett's family's fake empire. But I still drove my old pickup and wore the same Carhartt jackets. Nobody knew. The incident that changed everything happened in November, right before Thanksgiving. Rachel was 8 months along, could barely walk without her back aching. Brett was hosting this big dinner for his partners and some potential clients, wanted Rachel to look presentable for the evening. He gave her exactly $150 to buy a maternity dress, but insisted she shop at the boutiques in Birmingham, where his mother bought her clothes. It was a setup from the start. He knew those stores charged $300 to $500 for anything decent. He wanted her to fail, wanted an excuse to humiliate her. Rachel found this beautiful navy silk dress that actually fit her properly and made her look radiant. Problem was, it cost $200. She used my emergency money to cover the $50 difference, thought she'd solved the problem cleverly. The dinner started well enough. I wasn't invited, of course. Working-class fathers don't mix with insurance executives and their wives. But I was parked down the street in my pickup, engine running, watching their house. I'd been doing that. More often lately, just sitting there with a bad feeling in my gut that wouldn't go away. According to what Rachel told me later, Brett played the perfect husband all evening, introduced her as my beautiful wife to his guests, kept his hand on her lower back, complimented the way she looked in the dress. She actually started to relax, thinking maybe things were getting better between them. Maybe the baby was softening his heart after all. But the minute the last guest walked out that door, the mask came off completely. "Receipt," Brett said. Just one word, holding out his hand. Rachel's stomach dropped. She fumbled through her purse and handed over the slip of paper, hoping somehow he wouldn't notice the total. But Brett's eyes went straight to the number at the bottom. $200. He didn't yell. That was the terrifying thing about Brett. He rarely raised his voice. He just went completely cold, like all the warmth had been sucked out of the room. "You stole from me," he said, his voice flat and deadly. "I didn't steal anything," Rachel tried to explain, her voice getting higher. "I used my own money for the difference. The money my dad gave me." "So, you're taking handouts from your father now?" Brett's eyes were like ice, making me look like I can't provide for my own wife. "You think that's acceptable?" Nancy appeared from the kitchen where she'd been cleaning up, drawn by the tension like a vulture to roadkill. When Brett showed her the receipt, she actually laughed, this dry, cruel sound that made my daughter flinch. "She needs to learn the value of money, Brett. She's been spoiled her entire life." Spoiled? My daughter who worked 2 jobs through college, who painted houses in the summer to pay for art supplies, who never asked me for anything she didn't desperately need. Brett stared at Rachel with pure disgust. "The dress comes off. Right now. And since you can't follow simple instructions, you need a reminder of your place in this house." He demanded she strip. Out of the dress right there in their living room, in front of his mother. When Rachel refused and tried to walk upstairs to change in private, Brett grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to bruise. He was too smart for that, but firm enough to stop her cold. "You will learn respect," he hissed, inches from her face. I was sitting in my truck, sipping cold coffee from a thermos and listening to talk radio when I saw their front door open. Expected to see Brett walking some guest out to their car. Instead, I saw a figure stumble onto the front porch, and my heart stopped. It was Rachel. She was still wearing the navy dress, but I could see she was crying, her shoulders shaking. Then, to my absolute horror, Brett appeared behind her and gave her a push that sent her stumbling down the front steps. "You want to wear that expensive dress so badly?" he called after her. "Fine, wear it outside. Cool off out there. Maybe the fresh air will clear your head and remind you what you can and can't afford." The sound of that front door slamming shut was like a gunshot in the quiet November evening. Then I heard the deadbolt turn. It started to rain. Not just rain, that nasty Michigan sleet that cuts through your clothes and gets into your bones. Rachel pounded on the door with both fists, her voice muffled by the weather, but desperate enough that I could hear every word from across the street. "Brett, please. I'm sorry. It's freezing out here. What about the baby?" Through the front windows, I could see warm yellow light, shadows moving around inside. Brett and Nancy pouring themselves brandy, settling into the living room like nothing was happening, ignoring the pregnant woman, begging to come back into her own home. Rachel made it down to the bottom of their brick steps before her legs gave out completely. 8 months pregnant, soaked to the skin, she collapsed onto the wet cobblestones of their circular driveway. She curled into a ball, trying to protect her belly from the cold, and that's when something inside me snapped completely. My son-in-law had made my pregnant daughter kneel in the rain because she bought a dress. I threw my truck door open so hard it bounced off its hinges. The rage I felt wasn't the hot, red kind that makes you do stupid things. It was white hot, surgical, the kind that turns you into something dangerous and focused. I ran across that street like I was 25 again, my boots splashing through puddles, not caring about traffic or witnesses or consequences. Rachel was blue when I reached her, her teeth chattering so violently she couldn't form words. She looked up at me with unfocused eyes, rain plastering her hair to her skull. "Dad," she whispered through chattering teeth. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She was apologizing, freezing to death on her own driveway, and she was apologizing to me. That broke me completely and built me back up into something Brett Morrison had never encountered before. A father who'd been pushed past every limit he didn't even know he had. I pulled off my heavy work coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, helped her stand even though she was dead weight in my arms. Her lips were turning purple, and I could feel the baby moving frantically inside her belly, probably as distressed as she was. "Get in the truck," I told her, guiding her across the street. "Turn the heater on full blast." "He has my keys," she sobbed. "My phone, my purse, everything." "You won't need them," I said, and something in my voice made her stop crying and look at me. Not anymore. I settled her into the passenger seat, cranked the heat up as high as it would go, and then I turned back toward that house. I walked up those brick steps like I owned the place, like I had every right in the world to be there. I didn't knock, I didn't ring their fancy doorbell. I lifted my right leg and kicked that solid oak door right at the lock. It took 3 kicks to splinter that expensive door frame completely. The sound of that oak door slamming open against their marble foyer wall was like thunder. Brett dropped his brandy snifter, and Nancy screamed, clutching her pearls like they could protect her from what was walking through their broken doorway. They stared at me, soaked, muddy, and probably looking like something that had crawled out of hell itself. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Brett shouted, trying to find his voice. "I'll have you arrested for breaking and entering." I walked right up to him, got close enough to see the fear flickering behind his eyes. He was taller than me, but he'd never done a day of real work in his life. I could smell the expensive cologne and the brandy on his breath. "You have lost everything today," I said. Those 5 words came out calm and cold. "Get out!" Brett screamed, but his voice was shaking now. "Take your trash daughter and get out of my house." "Oh, I'm taking her," I said, my voice steady as stone. Then I reached over and grabbed Nancy's precious Ming vase from the hallway table, the one she'd bragged cost $3,000, and smashed it on their marble floor. The sound of it shattering echoed through their perfect house. "You're insane!" Nancy shrieked. "We'll sue you for everything." "I'm a father," I corrected her, "and you people just made the worst mistake of your lives." I turned and walked out through their broken door, got in my truck with Rachel, and drove straight to St. Joseph Mercy Hospital. Not the fancy private clinic where Brett had connections, but the place where real doctors worked, made sure the baby was okay first. He was fine, strong heartbeat, moving around like the fighter he was going to be. The next morning, the real war began. Brett called the cops about his door, filed reports, tried to get emergency custody of the unborn baby by claiming Rachel was mentally unstable and I was a violent influence. He thought he was playing chess while I was playing checkers. He had no idea what was coming. See, all those weeks I'd spent digging into the Morrison finances. All that research I'd done, I hadn't just found out they were broke. I'd found out exactly who held their debts. Brett's mortgage wasn't with First National anymore. It had been sold to a private equity firm called Archon Holdings for pennies on the dollar. Distressed debt, they call it. 2 weeks before the rain incident, Archon Holdings had been quietly acquired by a shell company I'd set up called Great Lakes Recovery. The seller thought they were dealing with another vulture fund. They had no idea Great Lakes Recovery was owned entirely by Carl Mitchell, retired Ford worker from Dearborn. I owned Brett's house. I owned his car loans. I owned the credit lines he'd been using to maintain his lifestyle. And I had detailed records of how he'd been skimming money from insurance settlements to cover his personal debts. Not huge amounts, just enough to keep his head above water. But embezzlement is embezzlement. 3 days after I kicked in his door, Brett walked into his office to find his partners waiting for him, with a lawyer and a security guard. I had sent them a complete dossier documenting his theft, with bank records, forged signatures, the whole thing. He was fired on the spot and escorted out with a cardboard box. But the real blow came at lunchtime. He drove home to find the locks changed and a Wayne County Sheriff's deputy standing in his driveway with a clipboard. "What is this?" Brett demanded. "This is my house." "Actually, sir," the deputy said, checking his paperwork, "this property has been foreclosed by the lien holder due to breach of contract and failure to maintain required insurance coverage." "I have insurance," Brett yelled, but he was lying. I knew he'd let the homeowner's policy lapse 3 months ago to free up cash flow. The mortgage contract had an acceleration clause, immediate foreclosure if insurance lapsed. I'd made sure the bank knew about it. Brett called Great Lakes Recovery, demanded to speak to the owner. The call got transferred to me. I put it on speaker so Rachel could hear every word. We were sitting in a warm, safe rental house in Royal Oak, hot chocolate in our hands. "Mr. Morrison," I said, "this is Carl." The silence was absolute. How do you own my mortgage?" "I own your mortgage. I own your debt. I own evidence of your fraud," I said calmly. "And because I'm a reasonable man, I'm giving you one choice. Sign over full custody to Rachel, renounce all parental rights, and leave Michigan. Forever. Or I hand everything over to the prosecutors and you go to prison." Took him about 10 seconds to decide. Bullies always fold when the tables turn. Brett signed the papers that afternoon. Within a week, he was gone, fled to Arizona to avoid criminal charges. Nancy had to move into subsidized housing in Pontiac after losing everything. Rachel gave birth to Tyler 3 weeks later. Healthy 7-pound boy with my stubborn chin and his mama's gentle eyes. We live quietly now, in a nice house in Ferndale. Rachel's painting again. Different style than before, darker maybe, but stronger. She's healing, getting back to who she really is. We never heard from Brett again. He sends the court-ordered child support from whatever hole he crawled into, but he's legally forbidden from any contact. As far as Tyler knows, his grandpa is the only father figure he needs. I think about that November night sometimes, watching my grandson play in our backyard, about the choice between staying quiet and taking action. It's easy to mind your business when someone's being hurt. It's harder to kick down doors. But that's what family does. That's what love looks like when someone pushes you too far. If you're listening to this and someone you care about needs a door kicked down, don't wait. Don't hope it gets better on its own. Take action. Be the person who shows up in the rain. Because protecting your family isn't optional. It's everything. Sometimes the most dangerous. Person in the room is the quiet one who's been watching, learning, and planning, while everyone else thinks they're powerless. A man's true strength isn't measured by his title or bank account. It's measured by how far he'll go to protect the people he loves when they can't protect themselves.